South Africa movement, Mmusi Maimane, is this morning launching the organization's economic recovery plan entitled Review, Repurpose, Rebuild and Reform. Let's take you there live.
If we fail to recognize the fact that our country has been adversely affected by this time of COVID, all of us are going to be impacted by the economic outcomes. And therefore today I'm proud to launch the One South Africa Economic Recovery Plan, really under the 4 R's, which is review, repurpose, rebuild, and reform. It is in fact our bold plan to restore and to build a new South African economy going forward. The plan is quite comprehensive. It lays out a number of specific interventions which seek to build a stronger, more revitalized South Africa post this COVID challenge that we faced. Fellow South Africans, prior to COVID, it is no secret the fact that South Africa was in a technical recession, and it already had hit our shores. That the pandemic and its devastating economic impacts meant that South Africa had little respite to stave off the repeated blows that have come to our economy and our workforce. And the indicators that we've been reading recently indicate a grim and a hard picture, which requires, in fact, a deliberate action and a plan upon which we can bring change. It's in fact predicted, fellow South Africans, that our economy will contract by approximately 11.5% for 2020, according to the OECD. Broad unemployment is now sitting at 42%, with 2.2 million people joining the ranks of the unemployed during the months of April to June this year. So effectively, what this means in real terms is that 2 out of 3 South Africans cannot find a job. There can be no greater crisis in our time today than the fact that 2 out of 3 of our fellow South Africans cannot find a job. We can debate all we like about whether a hard lockdown or a soft lockdown was necessary. These are academic issues now. What we need is in fact to ensure that we have a plan that is workable, a plan that we can be held to implementation, and ultimately a plan that we can monitor. If we fail at all of that, it cannot be another vague, wishy-washy statements that come from the political elite that fail to actually deliver the tangible outcomes of the people of our country. So, as I have stated, that our plan requires 4 approaches. It's the purpose of review, it's the purpose of repurposing, it's the purpose of reform, and it's ultimately to rebuild. So, in this light, and a comprehensive document will be circulated to members of the press and fellow South Africans, we argue for 20 interventions that we really believe this way we can be able to bring about change. All of us ought to be appalled and disgusted by those who loot from the resources of this country. It moves beyond the issue of corruption, because ultimately it can be considered as really taking the lives of citizens in this country. When you steal from PPEs, you are killing a life. So we cannot take a soft approach to corruption. And whilst there have been many other investigations that have taken place and prosecutions, we think more must be done. I hold the view that we must establish specialized corruption courts to investigate and prosecute both public and private sector corruption. It cannot be just business as usual. We need to implement continuous and permanent forensic audits of all politicians and government officials. I urge that anyone found of corruption, we must institute an immediate 15-year prison sentence if they are convicted of corruption. And furthermore, we must increase transparency in the tender process by introducing a universal online accessible system for all of us. Government has massive data that government can make that data available so that all citizens know how they can tender and compete. If we eradicate the question of corruption that has besieged all layers and spheres of government, we can then begin to create the economic resources that we need to fund economic growth. You can have a plan on infrastructure, you can have a plan on any other thing. Without the appropriate funding mechanism, those plans just become a pipe dream. So we have to stop the leaking bucket that is corruption, build an institutional capacity that polices corruption, but ultimately seals that bucket so that every resource that South Africa has is used for economic activity. So we really believe we have to immediately institute a debt to GDP cap on spending. This way, we can guide the Minister of Finance to ensure that we never exceed that cap. Fellow South Africans, there can be no debate. Us holding on to a state-owned airline, especially in these economic times, isn't going to help South Africa. We need to sell SAA. We need to ensure that in the region, we integrate independent power producers. We must speed that up so that ultimately we can stabilize the energy grid and ensure that our economy runs on the back of a stable energy. We regionalize the energy sector. We incentivize biogas. We bring on wind and solar projects. This has to be regionalized across the multiple countries so that we can ensure that not only do you have a broader consumer base, but you can maximize the natural resources of countries around us, such as Mozambique, Malawi, etc. We need to revitalize the SADC region by building a trade and development relation similar to that of the Asian Development Partnership model. On job creation, we hold the absolute view that we must create a Jobs and Justice Fund. In some ways, this must replace the BEE and distribute funds from businesses to real empowerment initiatives such as bursaries, mentorship programs, and apprenticeship. We took a stance even on the COVID funding. We need to now set up a fund that ensures that actually we become a startup nation. A nation where centers such as this one don't have businesses shutting down, but businesses that work. We must overhaul the regulations around SMME funding, particularly access to capital and the stringent rules of governing employment. We have to introduce a voluntary post-matric public service here to allow matriculants entry into a work-based training, gaining valuable work experience while earning a small salary. We have to increase the amount of tax rebates available to incentivize job creation and skills training for business. It must be the norm. The heroes of today cannot be people who are not, it can only be people who are creating jobs. If you create a job for a South African, you are a hero. Those are the people we must celebrate, incentivize, put the financial resources, give the appropriate tax incentives to, so that ultimately more and more people can create jobs. If you want to build one South Africa, it is born out of the premise that says it ought to be a nation where all citizens, regardless of race and where they come from, prosper together and live in peace together. So it ought to be a function of ensuring that the prosperity is on the back of building a startup nation, micro-enterprise, so that those who do that can be incentivized to do likewise. On education, we hold the absolute view that we must build an independent office of Inspector General of Education to investigate waste, improve effectiveness of public spending on education, and address the disproportionate powers of education from unions. It was clear when I went to Tembisa, when I hear in various communities, that money set up for schools has been looted. We need a body that investigates that, ensures that the standards of education are correct, and that ultimately we can prepare South Africans' minds to participate in the fourth industrial revolution and an economy that works for everybody. We must incentivize private sector funding for previously disadvantaged schools via tax rebates, the release of the high demand of spectrum to lower data costs and increase access to online resources for young people. And we need to implement ongoing training and examining of teachers via training colleges. Ultimately, You can all have a dream for what kind of economic model you want. If you do not have a state that is agile, that is competent, that is future-orientated, you cannot implement anything. So, in that view, we hold the view that the number of government departments and ministries must be brought down to 10 super ministries. We must introduce an incentives-based salary scale for all public sector employees to reward actually the top performers. Because if you want the best must be well rewarded, and when they do great things, they must be rewarded likewise. We must launch a national recruitment drive to attract the best talent and skills for public service. And then finally, this is also a requirement for political reform, that we introduce that bill to ensure that people are directly elected. This way, Parliament can be filled with men and women who are the best in the country, not people who survive on political patronage. So, fellow South Africans, in the midst of uncertainty, what you do not need is another elaborate plan, like the National Development Plan or something like that. What you do not need is a massive document. We need to demonstrate to citizens that we are making policy choices, we bring interventions in the short term that can ensure that whether you and I, we build a startup nation. That's what this country must be about. We must ensure that we build a nation where micro-enterprise can go. If we can give that certainty, build a competent state, adopt the 4 R's as I've articulated them, end the scourge of corruption, and ultimately introduce a competent state, we're able to deliver on the ambitions of our people. It is time for us to step up. And before I close this input on the economy, I want to speak a little bit about the incidents that took place recently in the community in Senegal. There can be no debate that our citizens across different races are under threat and in fear of living in crime. Murder is murder. It's regardless of who commits it and against whom is it committed. But to achieve an accountable policing mechanism, I want to urge that we allow and use the police system to be much more effective at arresting people who commit crimes. That what took place in Senegal indicates the fact that whilst having condemned murder, that the police did a job of arresting the suspects. And I want to call upon all South Africans that once the law takes its own course, we have to be, however long, however difficult it is, be patient to allow the law to take its own course. It can be tempting for all of us as South Africans to take the law into our own hands. But we have to respect institutional capacity, that those who commit heinous crimes can face up to court action, be prosecuted, and the appropriate sanctions be brought against them. The incident is fast becoming one that is racially polarizing, as people frame it as a war between Afrikaner versus a black South African. I want to say, undeniably, and for all the people in this country, we have to work together. We have to ultimately ensure that we do not allow this incident to divide our country, that we cannot reduce this war to a contestation between races, but that we ultimately, as we've built institutions, that we allow those to do their jobs and build one South Africa. As difficult as that is, and I understand that it is hard, no citizen ought to lose their lives in this country. We are all in a war against crime, and where that crime occurs in a farm, in a township, it is murder, it is crime, and we must unite against crime. But only we are going to win if we stand together, black and white, to fight the criminals. Let's not allow the criminals to divide us on racial bias. And therefore, I want to say that for fellow South Africans, Let us work together. Let us build one South Africa, because we've only got one South Africa to work towards. Thank you very much.
Mmusi Maimane there under his One South Africa movement, outlining their economic recovery plan, saying they're arguing for 20 interventions that will continue to unpack. Right now, let's take